Adolescence presents interesting questions about how online spaces radicalize young men into dangerous ideas, and how it can culminate into violence towards women. It's very transparently critiquing not only figures like Andrew Tate, but the Manosphere and the toxic rhetoric that keeps it breathing. One of the moments that stuck out to me was when Ashley Walters' character, who for the purposes of this video, I'm just gonna call Deshane because I like Top Boy. He referenced the blue pill and the red pill, and Deshane says, "Oh, you mean the Matrix?" And he doesn't know what he's talking about. Not just because we now have a generation of people that haven't seen the Matrix, but because Deshaun knows where this idea comes from, but his son only knows how it's currently being positioned to him. This is how a lot of toxic ideas of masculinity, and ultimately misogyny, function. It's passed down through generations of toxic rhetoric and made palatable to young boys through their insecurities, their fear of rejection, their fear of lacking in social standing, and selling an idea of desirability very much predicated on your proximity to women you can objectify. There's a really interesting moment during the therapy scene where Jamie explicitly states that part of why he pursued Katie was because of her weakness. He felt powerful, that her weakness made him feel more desirable. That there's a conflation between a woman's lack of self-worth serving as a means of remedying a man's lack of self-worth. But this entitlement and objectification speaks primarily to a way that masculinity has been sold to young people, specifically young boys, with the manosphere often serving to ensure that these ideas are properly sold to this generation. Andrew Tate created an entire career preying on the insecurities of young men, presenting them with conventional ideas of masculinity and social status, either through money or proximity to women, and uses that for his profit.
Women don't respect men with no hose. Bro, look a girl in the eyes and you her tell you you're gonna cheat on her. She loves it. Bro, man, they don't respect a man. They don't respect a man with no hose.
She goes out.
She's loyal to me for life. That's what I want. That's what I enjoy. I want to walk in the house and say, dinner. Where is it? And not in a horrible way. In a, I love you so much, I call you bitch. Where the is my food? I enjoy that position of power. You're not gonna have that if you ain't got hose.
The co-creators spoke to this very idea. Meanwhile, Graham first learned of Andrew Tate through his kids. I was looking at an online workout thing that our son, Alfie, sent me, and it was a good workout. 3 to 4 days later, the algorithm, which I don't understand, showed me the gentleman again, and he was telling me his misogynistic opinions and views. He speaks directly to how this ecosystem of desirability and self-improvement is a direct pipeline into these views. The algorithm, and by extension, many of the men behind these videos, are branding themselves around something very clear: the feeling of inadequacy young boys feel in a world that positions masculinity in a very specific way. And if this wasn't true, there wouldn't be that algorithmic correlation. If there wasn't a correlation between self-improvement for men and our relationships with women, then the framing wouldn't always be around desirability and social status.
2 years ago now, where I showed a picture of Andrew Tate on stage like this, and it was an assembly of year 9 and year 10 boys. The whole assembly stood up and gave the photo a standing ovation. Now, yes, that is a very extreme example, but for me, it was one of the most eerie and scary things I'd seen in my career up until that point, because I'd never seen that level of idolization in a group before. And it really opened my eyes to this idea of online and being online and accessing things online. It's something we need to look at with even more scrutiny than we currently are.
This is part of why books like The Power Book do really well. It preys on our feeling of inadequacy. Anyone reading a book explicitly about how to gain power is probably doing it because they don't feel powerful and feel the necessity to either understand it or fix it by acquiring it. In many of these cases, though, this power is exerted through women, selling an idea of masculinity which is ironically, inherently and intrinsically tied to your relationship and approach to women. Whether that's in the form of sexual conquest, the ability to control their actions, or your ability to assume control from this supposed new generation of scary women. This framing makes me question the framing of some of the ideas in Adolescence, though. While I do applaud its depiction of how this rhetoric cultivates a violent relationship with women and how they're perceived by men, the positioning of bullying being the catalyst feels odd. In interviews, they're on record stating that they don't want to point the finger at anyone. And as noble as I think that is, the picture it paints, positioning these young women as bullies to young men or young boys, and how that results in said violence, frames a messier picture. What does that framing communicate? Should women who speak on incels be prepared and expectant of men to become violent just because they're accused of this? In that same breath, should those same women be labeled as bullies for being able to identify those things? Writing can be done in any way, and as a result of this presentation, this message it communicates becomes muddier. Not because these situations are always black and white, but because when you frame the issue this way, you make one of the potential takeaways being that women shouldn't bully or educate young boys because they may randomly wake up and try to murder you. Let's take the case of Jake William Davison. On the 12th of August 2021, he was responsible for a mass shooting which killed 5 people, including his mother and a 3-year-old. A big part of this story is how Davison was radicalized by online spaces. He will talk about inceldom, the black-pilled worldwide view, and nihilism, describing himself as beaten down and defeated by life, someone who had nothing but themselves to rely on. Jake was very much like Jamie, and a massive conflict between himself and his mother was his sexist views on women. Online, he'd speak about his hatred of his mother, and many people spoke to how their relationship deteriorated as a result of how he felt to women. A neighbor told the paper, Maxine and Jake used to be closed. You'd always see him helping her with the shopping at Lidl down the road. But then his views changed, and he went up against women, and he became a misogynist. They clashed a lot about that. But the idea that his mother bullied him because she confronted him about his sexist views would be a lie. From what we understand, she even tried to get him some help. But it's examples like this which make me question the framing and why it feels very odd. Why would you position these young girls as bullies, when historically, in terms of these acts of violence, that just isn't the case? He even makes a similar point to Jamie in Adolescence, claiming that he missed out on teenage romance and sex when he was younger, and how there's nothing to look forward to as a result. One quote speaking to his feeling of inferiority because of not having sex, the other about how himself and many others don't get many matches on Tinder. In fact, not only did he speak quite often about his hatred towards his mother and her lack of accountability, he used her as an example of the type of woman that he can't stand. In one comment, he wrote, "Try being an unemployed, autistic, poor, sexually frustrated male with tons of health issues and no social circle and being stuck in government housing with my disgusting, abusive mother for years on end and having missed out on so much in life, and then come back and tell me if you're not negative." With this context in mind, we know what he thinks he's missing out on. We know why his relationship with his mother grew a massive strain. We understand vaguely how this culminated in an act of violence. And with this case study in mind, Adolescence presenting this issue through the lens of young men being bullied by these women that confront them on their sexism really does muddy the framing of its message in a way that I don't think helps its point. Another element of Adolescence that I think muddies its message is the fact that it's framed from the perspective of police officers. And while I love watching Deshane in these roles, a small part of me is like, why is he playing police?
I also want to hone in on an element of what Jake communicates here, because I worry that because a core piece of Adolescence's message is about how easy it is for young children to be radicalized into misogynistic rhetoric through these online spaces, that one of the key takeaways is going to be the tried and true, this is why we need to keep our kids away from the online world and have them go outside.
It was not for entertainment purposes. This was for us to learn a lesson or 5. Because let's talk about Nicholas Prosper. Are we starting to see the correlation now? Because the character Jamie Miller spent all his time in his room. That is what the parents said. They didn't see an issue. He wasn't roaming about being an asbo. He wasn't robbing shops. Wasn't beating people up in the street. No prior convictions. But he his entire family and planned the most biggest massacre in 21st century.
This is a very old head coded belief that I do sympathize with and understand, but I don't think acknowledges truly why these cases exist. A common fantasy is that people online aren't real, and therefore taking anything seriously online is ridiculous. The solution is then to get as far away from these online spaces as humanly possible. These spaces can be co-opted, these spaces can be unprotected. Here's the issue. These ideas don't come from thin air. Misogyny has existed long before online spaces have, and while there is a conversation to be had about how there's now focused algorithms dedicated to these kinds of ideas, they exist because these people still have these ideas. Speaking personally, I've seen more normalized misogyny in real life than I ever have online, and that's because my online space is very different from my environment. Spaces can be co-opted in real life. Spaces can be unprotected in real life. Let's take the case of William O'Neill. He was an informant sent to dismantle the Black Panther Party. There were whole initiatives dedicated to making sure they looked as evil and untrustworthy as humanly possible. Never mind the fact that they were trying to, help people out, food kitchens, free breakfast programs, education, etc. None of that is real. They were trying to break them down from the inside, and you still feel some of the effects of that within the media. These spaces do not exist because they are online. They exist because they are still parts of our culture. It's not the same, but for instance, contrary to conservative belief, marginalized groups don't just spawn online one day. They feel empowered because these online spaces are anonymous, so they can speak to their experiences. When we look at someone like Jamie, and our response is, this wouldn't happen if they just went outside, it sidesteps the fact that everyone online is a real person that you could meet outside the digital space, right? Jake's frustrations were also very clearly economically driven too. He was constantly bringing up his poverty, and it's always in relation to his desirability. He mirrors Jamie in this way. He uses traditional masculine ideas of money and power and conflates it with his desirability, and as a result of his economic status, he feels undesirable. The same night that Jamie went out and did what he did, his dad was working long hours to make sure that he could feed his children, that he could take care of his family. And these are things that are interesting to think about. And despite to some capacity even recognizing and calling attention to it, he resigns himself to the idea that he's unable to escape it. It's why these issues aren't just as simple as stepping away from the phone, because not only are we approaching a very digital world where most jobs are requiring of your understanding of these things, but because stepping away from the phone doesn't mean your parents are protecting you. Stepping away from the phone doesn't mean your communities are protecting you. Stepping away from the phone doesn't mean that you won't be exposed to the world in which this misogyny originates. And it certainly won't distract you from or address the economic struggles that make people frustrated. And until we are capable of addressing these things honestly within our communities, cases like Jamie will always exist, because the problem was never solely being online. And we have to be very careful that we don't kind of paint the whole conversation that way.
They did well. One of the main takeaways, there needs to be a collective interest and approach to addressing psychological well-being and development. Because the way that we're doing it at the moment, when everything is very individualistic, it only goes so far. Like, even me, when I'm working with someone one-on-one, like, I can't just think of the individual. Yes, they're here to learn individual things and learn about themselves as an individual, but it never is just about them. Like, there's way more things at play here, and we have to be able to recognize those things and address those things as well. And the thing is, we see it in the 4th episode when the parents are trying to figure out, like, what is going on here? Like, how did this happen? Was it them? Was it something else? And the thing is, it's all of those things, but they're all interlinked, and no one can be to blame completely.
And with tackling this uncomfortable subject matter, there's an element of propaganda here that does distract me. The children are framed as cruel and dishonest about how they feel, running at the first chance they can get. The show uses the severity of the situation to justify the cruel behavior and treatment of these young children. Deshane's character is really cruel to these kids. One he ends up chasing from the school across the street and holds him against the wall and starts threatening him, and he's rewarded with information that this student supplied the knife. The ideological work this does is communicate the only way to get this information out of some people is to be immoral and make these loud and violent threats in order to get information. A part of me wants to believe the first episode of the miniseries is trying to criticize how cruel the police can be, even in the context of a child, and the importance of protecting children from criminality because the police will dehumanize them. This idea is kind of disregarded because the big reveal is that Jamie did it. The big reveal is that the kid did give him the knife. So instead of this being uncomfortable, it's ironically portrayed as more of a natural necessity in the minds of the audience. But why does it matter? Why does it matter if he did it? Why does it matter if the kid gave him the knife? Does that justify the action? The problem is, the criticism of how the police treat these children is never mentioned again, because once their guilt is established, it's over. So despite presenting the police as an extreme in their actions initially, it shuts down all of the in-universe critiques of their actions through presenting their assessment as correct. And a question I do have to ask is, if this story is about the Manosphere, if this story is about parents not paying attention to the radical ideas that these children are being exposed to, if this story is about insecurities about masculinity being manifested into violent acts, why is it framed from the perspective of the police? Wouldn't it make more sense for the first episode to be from the perspective of Jamie, exploring having a crush, his insecurity regarding his desirability, his exposure to these online spaces, this sharing of explicit material that he speaks about in the therapy episode regarding the victim prior to all of this happening? Wouldn't that have been more effective? If your response to that is, well, that would be putting the spotlight too much on Jamie, it gives him too much grace. One, don't dehumanize people, let alone children. And two, the show kind of already does that anyway by trying to make a point about his bullying, his insecurity, and lack of protection from these dangerous ideas. Also, using the guy from Top Boy to play a cop is a very common trick. The black cop, where they can play the role of pushing why this normalized violence is okay. This normalized dehumanization is a necessary evil to uncover the truth. You can easily tell the same story with Deshane's character being the dad as being a teacher or something. That's just me though. Always call out the propaganda, don't let it slide. As a footnote, the last episode of the show was interesting, but also the weakest in my opinion. It just kind of felt like a little slow at points, if you want me to be honest. But there's a point I do really love about it. There's a massive point made to establish that the dad didn't physically abuse his child or mother, but behavior, actions, and inability to properly protect his son from dangerous ideas online is why this still happened. I quite like this because it communicates that violence isn't always physical. The power of the tongue, the power of our language can be quite violent. And it's important to acknowledge that despite defining ourselves outside our trauma and what we don't do, we need to be intentional on what we do with our children and by extension, our communities. This community point I want to hammer home on because there's a guy that spray paints on their van because of what happens. There's two perspectives. The people that bully them for what their child did, who clearly aren't more virtuous, and the sympathizers who simply agree with the cause and in some ways idolize their son for what he's done. This reminds me of the case of Gabrielle Frail in 2021, and by extension, Elliot Rodger in 2014. Frail, a prisoner of the Palmer Young Offenders Institution, denied both charges and gave evidence for his defense during the trial. He told the jury the mass shooting was a fantasy for him, and he had an empathy for the incel mass murderer Elliot Rodger. But he says he was not an incel and described killers as evil. There is this contingent of people that idolize his behavior, and that they're the ones providing a shoulder for these people to lean on in their moments of weakness. We see this with the dad, as the only character to overtly sympathize with his situation is someone trying to covertly bring him into this way of thinking. Meanwhile, we see almost a recreation of this moment where his dad is driven near to violence because of how he's being treated by those that don't subscribe to these ideas, creating this desolate feeling of loneliness. That a lack of genuine community and understanding is what leads people down these toxic pathways. And when the only hand available to you, the only one that displays any semblance of understanding, is the one shrouded in toxicity, how difficult it can be to walk away in spite of that. According to the writers, in a lot of ways, I could understand what would attract Jamie to these ideas, Fawn said. That idea of there being a reason why you aren't liked. There's a reason why you find it difficult to talk to women. He continued, there's a reason why you feel isolated from your parents. There's a reason why you're struggling academically. If you can put all of these things into an argument that makes sense, that's really dangerous. Adolescence is a fascinating story, not because I think it's perfect by any stretch, but because it's a catalyst for conversations to be had regarding what it means to support and protect young people.
Every parent's going to watch this show. When they finish watching this show, they're going to burst into their kids' room and be asking them, what's going on? How are you?
One piece of framing is that the goal of this work is to get parents to check on their children more. And I think this is important. I don't think it's fair to absolve parents of responsibility for protecting their children. But equally so, I think the question is larger. What are our communities doing to help these young boys? What are they doing to protect these children from these ideas? What alternative ideas are being offered? How can we bolster the self-confidence of young boys without sending them down a rabbit hole of toxic rhetoric? Well, I have some ideas. Black masculinity is something I don't talk about a lot, but I do have some passionate thoughts about it. The first of which being, if you let someone tell you how to be a man, then you've probably already kind of started fighting a losing battle. No matter how many people, including myself, sell you ideas of what masculinity is in the media, so long as you identify as a man, you're a man. Everything else is just validation politics, it's just comparison. And while I know it can be very difficult when other men and even some women have internalized ideas of patriarchy, those experiences aren't a statement on everyone. Social media is designed to get you to react. That's how these algorithms work. If you're seeing silly videos and tweets about the other gender and putting them in these binary categories and ideas, it's being shown to you because it's going to get you to react. Stop engaging with it. Practice restraint. Don't click into it. Don't read the comments. Don't watch the video. All of that is engagement, and the algorithm will see that and show you more. If you feel inadequate because you don't have a lot of money, that isn't inherently your fault. We live in a system that puts us against each other. Charity and mutual aid only exist because capitalism doesn't work. You shouldn't feel any shame in needing help and support, even though I know that can be hard, right? And even if someone in your life tries to check you, don't worry, they're just wrong. People buying into these ideas isn't a statement on you. It's a statement on them and perhaps the culture. And as for relationships and feeling desired, there's nothing more desirable than knowing who you are and what you stand for. Someone with empathy and understanding to other people. Someone who listens to what they're saying and what they're going through. Someone who genuinely cares for others outside themselves. When I speak to desirability, I'm obviously not talking about romantic partners inherently. You shouldn't expect companionship or sexual encounters just because you do these things. That's wrong. But if you're feeling lonely and want to build genuine, platonic relationships, approach with humility. Don't be quick to put people in boxes. People notice that. Let people in and connect with them. Be genuine, be real, just be yourself. You're good enough just being you. That's just me though. Again, I'm not trying to make people think like me. I'm just trying to make people think, just in general. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. I'm the storyteller and I'll see you around.